Thank you very much for coming. Yes, my talk tonight is based around a question: is the mind a physical thing? Which is a version of a very long-standing question in philosophy. Now, I'm going to begin by quoting a philosopher from a rather different area of the subject, Timothy Williamson from Oxford, who in his paper called Is Knowing a State of Mind, he began his paper by saying, "Let there be no vulgar suspense." He said, and the title will be answered in the negative. He actually said the title will be answered in the affirmative, but my title is going to be answered in the negative, so you know exactly what this talk is going to do. It's going to answer the question no, with the answer no. So that's my homage to Williamson to begin with. And the other piece of homage I want to construct is to the John Templeton Foundation, who for the last 2 years have funded a project here in the University of Cambridge called New Directions in the Study of the Mind. This is a 2-year project which has been a very complex exercise. We've funded over 20 different sub-projects all around the world along the theme of what we call non-physicalist, non-reductionist conceptions of the mind. We also have a group of researchers here in Cambridge, some postgraduate students and postdoctoral fellows who've been talking about these things. And my lecture today is in some ways going to summarize the views of at least one member of that group, that's me. I can't summarize the views of all the others because being philosophers, of course, they all disagree, so we actually can't work together and come up with the same view, but I've been stimulated by their stubbornness to try and express what I think about what I call the non-physicalist view of the mind. Now, physicalism, as I'm sure you all know, is the idea that, applied to the world as a whole, it's the idea that in some way or other everything is physical. Applied to the mind, it's the view then that the mind is physical. Now, this is a kind of, in some ways, an orthodox view in philosophy and in the philosophy of mind, perhaps in natural science too. When you say that you're not a physicalist to people, then they either say, is that the time? I really must be leaving, or something. Or they say that you're committed to all sorts of unacceptable things. If you say you're a physicalist, people say that you believe in Cartesian substances, or that you believe in spooks, or that you believe in fairies at the bottom of the garden, or ghosts, or immaterial souls, or life after death, and things like that. Now, there may be all sorts of reasons or arguments that could be given for believing in things like that, but that's not part of my non-physicalism or my anti-physicalism. So I'm going to explain why today. What I want to do today is to show why rejecting physicalism about the mind does not involve accepting any of those things. So the rest of my talk's going to have 4 parts. The first time I'll say a little bit about the traditional mind-body question in very broad terms. Then I'll say something about the concepts of physical and the concept of thing in order to try and articulate what this question, is the mind a physical thing, amounts to. I'm going to look at some alternative ways of looking at physicalism other than the traditional ways, and I'm going to dismiss them in a sort of Olympian, high-handed manner. And at the end I'll say a little bit about how I think we should look at the question of mind and body, or the relationship between mind and body, looked at in a somewhat different way from the way it's normally posed in the contemporary philosophy of mind. So that's, if you like, the new direction that we've been that I've been trying to get to during this period of this project. So the traditional mind-body question is framed frequently in terms of substance, and in terms of the question whether there's one substance or two substances, or one kind of substance or two kinds of substance. Dualism being the view that there are mental and material substances, and materialism the view that there is only material substance. Now, I'll say a little bit about what substance means in a minute, but just so to jog your memory, here is Descartes, who thought that each individual mind was a substance, and that the material world too is a substance. The material world is one substance, matter. On a materialist view, the materialist holds that everything is matter, and if the materialist believes in substance, then they will say that material substance is the only substance. So that's a very broad, vague statement of the traditional contrast between materialism and dualism. The traditional problem, then, is that if could be put in terms of a dilemma, I suppose. This isn't how it was expressed in the 17th century, but this is how, looking back, we could see some strains of thought that are in conflict in such a way that could be expressed by this dilemma. Where the first horn of the dilemma, as it were, is about dualism, attacks dualism and says that if dualism is true, how can mind and body interact? Now, in order to make that into a proper problem or question, you have to add a lot of assumptions, which I'm not going to go into in this lecture, but I'm very happy to talk about them afterwards if anyone wants to. The other horn of the dilemma, though, is that if materialism is true, then how can consciousness exist? Or if everything is material, how can something be conscious? So sort of the problem of consciousness is the problem for materialism, and the problem of interaction or mental causation is the problem for dualism. And so that I think, sort of broadly speaking, sums up the traditional mind-body problem. And in a famous series of letters with Descartes, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia asked him how the soul of a human being, it being only a thinking substance, can determine the bodily spirits and so bring about voluntary actions. That's a classic statement of the objection from mental causation or psychophysical interaction. On the other hand, Descartes himself thought that it was there were so many reasons, there were overwhelming reasons to think that matter itself could not think, where thinking for Descartes was something conscious. So problem. I don't think actually that the problem of consciousness today is the problem for Descartes, but Descartes certainly thought that, or rather it's not the problem of consciousness as it's expressed today is not the thing that gives rise to Descartes' dualism, but Descartes thought that matter was incapable of thinking, therefore being conscious, since these were the same thing. Now this is a Exhibit 1. Is a picture of some brains, and I think you can get a feel for this intuitive idea that how can the brain produce consciousness. It's a very natural thought. The brain does produce in some way, in combination with all sorts of other things. The brain does give rise to consciousness. Everyone knows that, but how that actually can come about can seem like a very puzzling thing. And not just in philosophy, you find it in all sorts of places. I found a nice example in that there was this film with Meryl Streep and about a journalist in New York City who wanted to cook every recipe in Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cookery. I think there were maybe 365 recipes, and she wanted to cook every recipe, one recipe a day for a year. It's called Julie and Julia. It's a bit sort of, it's a rather sort of arch, sentimental sort of film, but in the book, on which this film is based, she talks about cooking brains, and she finds brains quite repulsive, but also kind of fascinating. And I think when you see brains, that's the combination of feelings that you have. You think they seem so simple, so greasy, rather repellent, and yet you know that this is responsible for so much. It's really puzzling. She puts it very nicely. She says it isn't so much the taste with brains, though that's no great shake. So I disagree with that, actually. But it isn't the ick factor, the way when you wash them, they inevitably wind up with bits of brain matter strewn Tarantino-esquely around the sink in your garments, and the weird, gummy, fatty, white matter that holds the brain together, which is like fat, I guess. No, the real problem is the philosophical tailspin part, the inconsolable mystery of life, consciousness, the soul. I want a brain to be tightly knit and deeply furrowed, conduited with the circuitous pathways of thought and deep receptacles of memory. But no, it's just this flabby, pale, small organ that disintegrates in your fingers if you let the faucet run too fast. How can this be? How can we be? She says. So it takes things onto another level here. How can we be? But she's right. Apologies to vegetarians in the audience. But it's true. Anyone who's seen brains, she's right. It's just intensely puzzling how this can come about. Now, a neuroscientist might say correctly that actually the brain is tightly knit and deeply furrowed, conduited with circuitous pathways. That's what the brain is like. The brain is full of connections and valleys and rivulets and all these things. And so. But that's not really the point. I mean, it's not as if you look at the brain under a microscope and you see the connections between neurons, as if that's going to make it any more apparent how this thing produces consciousness than it is if it's sitting on a plate. So I think it's a nice statement of this intuitive thought. So that's the traditional problem. My second point is about the notion of a physical thing, and here we need to break things down in the style of philosophy, and we'll look at the concepts of physical and the concept of thing and see what we can learn from that. Now, the idea of material substance, the matter as material substance, is not so much in vogue these days. People will talk rather in terms of physicalism, as I did at the beginning, rather than materialism. There are lots of reasons why that is. I think two reasons could be mentioned. One is that the materialism has the connotation of everything being material or matter or made of matter or something like this. And the second reason is that, related to that, is that physics, which gives its name to the doctrine of physicalism, physics is a universal science whose principles apply to everything in space and time. But physics doesn't just deal with matter. There's more to the physical than just matter in the sense, either in the 17th century sense or in any sort of common sense in which things are made of matter. There are physical properties, there are forces, fundamental forces, and there are fields of space-time, and these things aren't in any way obviously matter. So if you want your theory of what there is, your ontology, to be guided by the science, the universal science, which is what physicalists want to do, then you should formulate your theory not in terms of matter or some sort of relatively a priori concept of matter, but rather in terms of what that science says there is, what physics says there is. So physics doesn't just talk about matter, it talks about all these other things as well. The physicalist is someone who says whatever physics says there is what there fundamentally is. Some people go further. I'm missing a slide here, but Rutherford said, as a joke, or half joke, that he once said that there is physics and there is stamp collecting. So if you think that's a sort of extreme physicalist view, I think there's not much else to it apart from physics. So I think that's the idea of the physical, which is in play in much contemporary philosophy, metaphysics and philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. There is another idea of the physical, and I should mention this for the enthusiasts among you, that there's an idea of the physical that comes from the idea of a physical object, where a physical object is just a spatio-temporal object. And the difference between that idea of the physical and the idea of the physical that comes from physics has been very nicely explored by Daniel Stoljar in some work on this subject. Anyway, and let me say something then about thing. I introduced the title "The Mind is a Physical Thing." I didn't say the mind is the mind a physical substance, and I'll give the reason for that later. Not all things are substances. I think on anyone's view, not all things are substances. I'm going to have to tell you in a minute what I'm understanding here by substance, but the basic idea, I think, is that a substance is in some way the fundamental reality. What substance is what the world most fundamentally is. If there are things which are not fundamental realities, so for example, if there are, take Descartes' view, for example, a substance for him was what was capable of independent existence. And then the individual things we find around us, sort of material things, those are modes of material substance, sort of modifications in the material substance. So these material things, like tables and chairs and so on, they're not substances. Our bodies are not substances on Descartes' view, but they are just aspects of the material substance. Things that just sort of hang together by accident, a ball of dust in the corner of the room, that can be a thing, but not a substance on almost anyone's view. So thing is a rather broad category, and it can mean a number of different things. Thing can mean a number of different things. For some people, the way they use the word thing in philosophy, they tie it very closely to the idea of an object, where an object is a particular object, so something that is a particular, that can be a bearer of properties. But more generally, people use the word thing just to mean any entity. Some people go even further and say that there are non-existent things. So thing is such a broad category here, it's inevitable that not all things are going to be substances. If thing means entity, then properties, processes, and even events are things in a sense, and we shouldn't object to using the word thing in that way. Thing would just be the most general ontological category. So a physical thing could be an object or entity that's a subject matter of physics, so maybe physical property like mass or some charge or something like this, and physical or a physical property. Yeah, a physical property could be a physical thing in this sense, or a physical object could be an object that has physical properties. So we can say physical things either are or they have physical properties. That's what a physical thing is, in the most generous interpretation of thing and the most contemporary interpretation of the word physical, in the philosophical sense of physical. That's an important qualification. I'm talking about the philosophical sense of the word physical. It's not the sense where you say there might be a physical thing going on between two people. That's a different kind of sense of the word physical, which I'm not dealing with today. I hope to deal with it in other work. Substance, then. Let me clarify this whole thing. I said substance is a fundamental reality. In the most famous picture of philosophers that there is, the picture that's on every philosopher's website, every philosophy department's website, at Raphael's School of Athens, we have in the middle, let me show you this picture here. In the middle of this famous picture we have Aristotle holding his hand like this, sort of chilling out. So then Plato's holding his hand like this, his hand to the sky. There's Aristotle in the middle holding his hand like that. Now, I think it's plausible to understand that contrast as indicating the difference between thinking that the fundamental reality of the world lies within experience, which is what Aristotle's view was, that the fundamental reality of the world lies within the world of experience, or that the fundamental reality of the world lies outside the world of experience, and that was Plato's view, that the world of experience was in some way an illusion, and that what was real, what was most real, lay outside of experience. Now, in Aristotle's sense of the word substance, what he called the primary substances were those things which are fundamental realities, which are unities in themselves. And organisms are the prime example of things that are unities in themselves. So I'm going to call them natural unities. But 17th century conceptions of substance then were very different. And of course Descartes characterized his conception of substance all in a very minimal, abstract way, which doesn't apply to things like animals and natural unities. Descartes' conception of substance was of that which can, that is capable of independent existence. And so since our minds are capable of independent existence, independent of our our bodies and the rest of the material world and of one another, then our minds are distinct substances. The material world isn't capable of independent existence from other parts of it, so the material world is just one substance, but it's capable of independent existence from the mind. So that's what substance is for Descartes. What's conceivable as being existing independently. And then, of course, and you have the discussion of substance, famous discussion of substance in Locke, where where one of the uses of substance Locke uses is this idea of something I know not what that underlies all the qualities of things. Substance there as a substratum or something like this. Now there are many other ideas of substance in 17th century and early modern philosophy. I'm just draw attention to these because these are the most well-known or favoured today. So for those who are familiar with mind-body discussion recently, in the last 20 years or so, you'll see that the idea of being capable of independent existence is what drives the conceivability arguments of Kripke and David Chalmers and things, because they think that you can conceive of a body without a mind. If you can conceive of a body without consciousness, then consciousness is something separate. So if it's separable, then it's separate. So there's a kind of Cartesian thought behind that, although they're not actually operating with the concept of substance. Anyway, then I put Aristotle's concept as somewhat different, the idea of substance as a natural unity. So you can see there are lots of different ideas here. And the question is whether these are ideas that we really want to take on board. I mean, there are two questions really. One is, do we formulate our views in terms of these ideas of substance? And then should we? If we do, should we? Now, certainly if you consider the Cartesian or the Lockean conception of substance, then I hazard to say that that contemporary philosophy and science has no use for these concepts. I think there is no there is no serious metaphysics or physical theory that I know or understand that uses concepts of substance as Descartes and Locke in Locke's abstract sense of substance. And I think that's probably the right way to go. If you think in terms of what's capable of independent existence, this introduces so many possible qualifications of what sort of independence, which things are really independent from one another, causal independence versus gnomic independence versus necessary independence. And there are so many different views you could adopt here that the idea of being capable of independent existence does not pick out one clear category that should be the fundamental idea in our ontology. I mean, as a matter of fact, I don't think many people use those concepts of substance. The Aristotelian concept, I think, is used, and I'll come back to that a little bit at the end. So I observe that the concept of substance is not actually an important concept in contemporary philosophy or science. So this raises the question, then, of what the contrast between physicalism and dualism comes down to, if not a contrast between substances. So we're actually in this rather peculiar situation that we tell our students in the first week of Philosophy of Mind course that there's this question of whether there's one substance or two. And then we say Descartes thought there were two substances. And then we say, well, that's a bit of a rubbish view, isn't it? And then we give loads of arguments against this view. We give sort of 50 pages of arguments against this view, often parodying the view and sort of making fun of it. And then we say, well, what we really should believe is there's just one substance, and that's, materialism, something like that. And then you're off, and you describe all the different versions of materialism. But as a matter of fact, none of these people who are teaching these courses, I would guess, really believe in substance. So why do they frame a problem in that way if they don't believe in substance in any of these senses? It's like you introduce a problem in terms of a category that no one actually accepts. So that's a puzzle, I think, about how to interpret how we are explaining these problems to people. We explain the problems historically, and that's a different matter. But explaining it as if it was somehow an intuitive problem, a bit like the problem of looking at the brain and seeing how consciousness is produced, that has nothing to do with the idea of substance. So there's a puzzle there for how we should think about teaching these things. So this is, I think, a real question. What does the contrast between physicalism, dualism come down to if it's not a contrast between substances? We know what it was in the 17th century, roughly speaking. But what is this contrast now? What is it that physicalists are so adamant in believing and that dualists are so adamant in denying, and vice versa? Well, it can't just be the distinction between everything being a physical thing, which comes down to everything has physical properties. Everything is a physical property, or it has physical properties in the sense of physical I mentioned. It can't just be the contrast between that and dualism, that there are two kinds of thing. So we can't just say, well, by substance they meant thing, so let's ask ourselves whether everything's a physical thing versus whether there are two kinds of thing, mental things and physical things. Because actually those two views are perfectly compatible. You can hold that everything is a physical thing and hold that there are two kinds of things. For example, you could hold, well, just to spell it out, you could say everything has physical properties. Some of those things also have mental properties, and namely human beings, for example, or animals. They're conscious, they think, and they have the mental properties, but they also have physical properties. So everything is a physical thing, is compatible with saying that some things have mental properties. So that can't be what the issue is, because those two views are plainly compatible. Maybe they're even both true as well. So I think what we need to do is to look at other conceptions, more specific conceptions of physicalism, and see whether we can understand what the contrast is in other terms. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at one very specific philosophical conception of physicalism, and then I'm going to look at what I think a lot of people think is a rather intuitive idea of what physicalism or materialism is. So that's my question. How else might physicalism be formulated? And the standard view, I think, today, one of the standard views, in some parts of the world it's the standard view, in other parts not so much, is that physicalism should be formulated as the doctrine of supervenience, where in the classic formulation of David Lewis and Frank Jackson, supervenience is expressed as a view about worlds, possible worlds. And Lewis's way of formulating physicalism was that any world which is a physical duplicate of this world is a duplicate in every respect. So that's what it is for physicalism to be true of this world. Any world that's what he called a minimal physical duplicate of this world is a duplicate in every respect, or duplicate simpliciter. And that's meant to express the idea that the physical nature of things determines or necessitates the entire nature of things. So that there is actually a necessary connection between the physical nature of things and the non-physical nature of things, or the entire nature of things. And that necessary connection is expressed in the fact that there couldn't be a world which was a physical duplicate of this world in every respect, but differed in some other way. Now, that's to say that this is a doctrine of necessitation. It doesn't mean that it says that physicalism is a necessary truth. Physicalism is a contingent truth because it's a truth about this world. It's expressed in terms of this world. So there are worlds where physicalism isn't true. It's just, on Lewis's view, our world has what he calls the merit of being a world in which physicalism is true. And that's because any world which is a physical duplicate of this world is a duplicate in every respect. So that's the idea of the supervenience physicalism of the Lewis form. If you haven't come across that idea before, it's much simpler than it sounds. We could express it in terms of an answer to the question of what would God have to do to create this world just as it is. And a supervenience physicalist says, now God here is an explanatory device, just to make that clear. The supervenience physicalist says all God would have to do to create this world just as it is to create its physical nature, and everything else would come for free. So on the physicalist view, God wouldn't need 6 days to create the world. God could create the world in 1 day, maybe in a second. All God would have to do was create the physical nature of the world, and then he wouldn't need extra days to create Adam and Eve and the animals and everything. It would all come for free. So that's the image. Everything is necessitated or determined by the physical. Now, there's a lot to be said about that, but the question I want to ask is whether it's compatible with dualism. That is, whether it's compatible with the idea that there are distinct mental entities which are not physical. Now, if that's all dualism is, the mere distinctness of the mental and the physical, that's plainly compatible with supervenience physicalism, because all supervenience physicalism says is that you fix the physical nature of things and you fix everything else. Now, you would have to say then that there's if you fix the physical nature of things, then you also made it the case that there was some mental, non-physical thing. That would be a bit of a mystery on this view, because it might be thought to be a mystery why it is that the physical nature would give rise to this mental thing. But there's a mystery there on anyone's view, so that's not an objection to the compatibility. All I'm talking about here is the compatibility of the idea that there are distinct mental things with the idea that the supervenience physicalism is true. But notice that also supervenience physicalism does not imply that the mind is a physical thing, in the sense in which I said earlier on. So supervenience physicalism doesn't imply that the mind has physical properties, or that the mind is a physical property, or that the mind is the subject matter of physics. So this supervenience physicalist doctrine, as it stands, seems very weak. It doesn't seem strong enough to express a view that could be contrasted with a dualist doctrine. Now, a lot has been said about that in the philosophical debate, which we can come back to if anyone wants to do that. I just want to say that on the face of it, this very sophisticated form of physicalism doesn't seem to be the sort of view that's going to rule out some minimal sort of dualism about the mind, where you think the mind is a non-physical thing, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a minute. So that's the rather sort of specifics, precise version of physicalism, but some people say to me, well, but surely there's a more intuitive idea of physicalism behind this whole thing, behind these attempts to formulate it in terms of possible worlds or physical properties and something, and it's the idea that it's something that the idea that everything's made out of the same kind of stuff, the kind of stuff that physical objects are made out of. So physical objects are made out of atoms and molecules, and everything's made out of those. Ultimately, everything's made out of those, and that's all there is to it. There's nothing else. And I think that is quite an intuitive view until you think about it for a bit. Until you ask yourself, well, if we're talking about the mind, what do we think the mind is made out of? If physicalism is going to be true of the mind, whatever that is, then we ought to be able to say that the mind is made out of the same kind of thing that physical or material objects are made out of. I think this, in order to address that question, we need to turn to something which I haven't mentioned yet, which is what it means to call the mind a thing at all. And now some philosophers think that this is a kind of mistake, and that you can get yourself into confusion or error, or fallacies. You commit fallacies if you say things like the mind is a thing. That if you say the mind is a thing, then that means, well, if the thing is like a chair or a lectern, it means you can pick it up. Does this mean you can pick up your mind? And this, you've probably heard sorts of objections like that, maybe even in this university. Hilary Putnam says a thing along these lines, where he says that the view I've long defended is that the mind is not a thing. He says, talk of our minds is talk of world-involving capabilities that we have and activities we engage in. Now, capabilities that we have, activities we engage in, that's all very appealing and a very attractive idea, that we do have these capabilities. We have the capability or capacity to think, to reason, to remember, to imagine. We have the capacity to perceive and to speak, and we have the ability to do things, to decide things, to form intentions, and so on. That's all fine. But there's a false contrast in what Putnam says, because when he says the mind is not a thing, or the mind, he seems to be contrasting the mind being a thing with the idea that talk of the mind is talk of capacities or capabilities or abilities, or I'll just use all those words to mean the same thing. But there's no reason to think that there's any real contrast here, or that there's any opposition between saying something is a thing and saying that saying that talk of that thing is talk of its capacities. And I think it's perfect. There's a perfectly sensible way in which the mind is a thing, a perfectly intelligible way, when we said that the mind is a collection of those capacities. The mind is a collection of mental capacities or faculties. So what I mean by that is the capacities of perception, memory, language, reasoning, decision-making, imagination, and so on. These are the mental capacities or mental faculties. Now I want to distinguish between a capacity and the exercise of a capacity. So if we think of perception, philosophers will talk about perception being a mental state, or perception being a mental event, or something. I think this isn't quite right. Perception is a capacity or a faculty that we have. So visual perception is the capacity to see. The exercises of that capacity are episodes in your consciousness, or if there's unconscious perception, episodes in your unconscious mind. So we can distinguish between the capacity and its exercises. And I think when people talk about mental events or processes, it's good to think of those as the exercises of mental capacities. Mental states then can be the products of these capacities. So what I have in mind here is something like, if you think you have the capacity to reason, the capacity to reason can result in an event of judging something, say, which is a momentary thing, an event, and that will result. So that's the exercise of the capacity, and that exercise of the capacity can result in you believing something. So the belief, which is a persisting state, is the product of the exercise of this capacity of judgment. That's the picture that I have of the relationship between capacities, their exercises, and mental states. So when I say what is the mind, I'm not starting with the idea of a mental state or a mental event. I think that's somewhere further up the explanation. I start with the idea of mental capacities or mental faculties. Now, a collection of these capacities or faculties can be a thing in the perfectly innocuous sense of thing that I mentioned earlier on. Not in the more youthful, trendy way of people saying, is this still a thing? The collection of mental capacities is a thing, and it's still a thing. But it's a collection. Now, a collection is not a substance. That's what, in any of the senses, but I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But the reason I say it's not a substance is because it's not a natural unity. So this is why you can have different kinds of minds, because different kinds of minds will be different collections of mental capacities. The dog's mind and the squirrel's mind will be different from the human mind, because they have different structures of their capacities. So that's what the mind is. If you then ask the question, well, what's the mind made of? Is the mind made of the same thing that everything else is made of? Are mental capacities made of the same kind of thing as physical objects? Then I want to say that's a bad question. You've got to think again. If you end up asking that question, you've got to think again, because what are capacities made of? There's the thing that has the capacities, and that thing is made of things, it has parts and so on. By being made of, I'm thinking of being made of parts, So the thing has the parts, the brain has the parts, the person, the organism has parts, objects have parts, but capacities don't have parts. Or if they do, they have them in some different sort of way, but not in the way that ordinary objects are made of parts. So that's the question I think is a bad question, because it doesn't make much sense to say what capacities or the exercises of capacities or their properties are made of. What is a perceptual state or a perceptual episode made of? Is it made of the same kind of things that tables and chairs are made of? I think that if you're forced to ask that question, then you've got on the wrong bus at a certain point. So what I'm trying to persuade you here is how to get off that bus at the beginning by distinguishing between the collection of capacities and the thing that has those capacities. Now, this is a very different kind of way of thinking of things, I believe, from the traditional debate about substance, where you start off with this idea, is there one substance or two? But I think once you give up that ambition to express your ontology in terms of the idea of substance, then I think it's going to be hard to formulate a plausible thesis about the stuff that everything is made of. I think you could spin up, you could make something up. You could talk about mereology, and you could say that properties have parts, and that the parts are, and after all, properties are just sets of individuals, and sets have parts, and you can make up all that stuff like people do, but that's unreal. It's unreal. That's not what properties are. When I say that the person has the capacity for memory, I'm not talking about a set of memories. I'm talking about some concrete ability or capacity that an organism has. So I'm not denying that there's some way in which you might be able, through some philosophical definitional ingenuity, come up with some view that translates what I'm saying into how some things could have parts in a certain sense. But what I'm inviting you to say is let's look at what we know and what strikes us as most obviously true, which is there's a difference between something like an organism and the capacities that it has. Where the organism might be made of things, the capacities aren't. Here's another way in which I think that the mind-body problem is presented to people, maybe to students, or in introductory textbooks and things, in a way which I think is very misleading. That people will say, on the one hand, you have matter. We all know what that is, because look, it's around us. Here it is, chairs and tables and stuff. We know about that. And there's science, and science tells us all about matter. Everything's made of everything in the material world is made of matter. On the other hand, there's this really weird view that there's this thing called the mind, and that's made of something else, some other sort of ghostly stuff. But what the hell's that? Now, I want to say at that point, I said, well, you're the person who introduced it, right? I'm not. The person, Descartes, who thought that the mind was a substance which was distinct from material substance, he didn't think that the mind was made of one kind of thing and that material objects were made of another kind of thing. The mind wasn't made of anything at all. That's the point of saying that the mind is a simple substance, is that it's not made of anything. And the mind has its characteristic attribute, But that's not a part of the mind, that's what makes it the mind. That's the characteristic attribute of thought. And then all the individual mental states and so on are modes of thought. But Descartes did not hold that the mind was made of was a different kind of thing from the stuff that the material world was made of. So here what I want to encourage you to entertain is the idea that we shouldn't make up absurd theories, attribute them to people in the past or to merely imaginary people, and then spend 50 pages refuting them. We should instead try and look at what people actually did say, or what actually might be the case. So I agree that there is stuff in some sense, there is matter, things are made of stuff, but many things aren't made of stuff, that's all. The properties and capacities and faculties, these things aren't made of stuff. So my final section of my talk, I've said something about the traditional problem, I've said something about the idea of a thing and a physical thing, what I mean by that, and I've said something about whether there are other forms of physicalism that might have, where it's easier to formulate a mind-body question than it is using the notion of substance. And so I now want to say something about a little bit more about how to develop this way of looking at the mind and its distinctness from the body, and what happens to the mind-body question or the mind-body problem if you think about it in this way. So I say the mind is a thing, but the mind isn't a substance. Now, so I should come clean at this point that I think the most appealing notion of substance, if there is going to be a notion of substance at all, is the Aristotelian notion of a natural unity or something like that. I'm attracted to that idea. I don't know how far that idea can be taken in precise metaphysics, but I think it's undeniably a fact that there are natural unities. The mind is not, in that sense, a natural unity. The mind is more like a collection. It's a collection of these faculties, but not a substance in the Aristotelian or in any other sense. Psychological reality, I want to say, consists of these capacities and their exercises, and the products of the exercises like that. So it consists of capacities, mental events and processes, and mental and the mental states that may result. I think that the picture I've just described is a naturalistic picture in the sense that it conforms to how psychology thinks about the mind. I think naturalism is a pretty empty word, but I think if it means something like an enterprise, that you see the enterprise of understanding the world philosophically as continuous with the enterprise of understanding it scientifically, if it means something like that, then what I'm saying, I believe, is naturalistic. If you open a psychology textbook, you find that it will be divided up into chapters like perception, learning, memory, reasoning, emotion, language, and so on. That's what you find in any standard psychology textbook. You don't find all there is material substance and its properties, and those properties and psychological properties supervene on the material properties. So that's that whole view that psychological properties supervene on fundamental physical properties is a very abstract and rather unrealistic conception of the world. The conception that you get from psychology, the conception of the mind that you get from psychology, is that there are these faculties or capacities of the mind, and that's what the subject matter of psychology is. I don't think the subject matter of the philosophy of mind is any different from the subject matter of psychology. I think it's just a different kind of way of addressing that subject matter. Now, I haven't mentioned anything about the brain, apart from I showed you a picture of a real brain. And I can envisage that someone will just say, well, you're talking about the mind, but isn't the mind the brain? Isn't that what we're really talking about here? Now, there's many things to be said at this point, and I've rather avoided them to try and approach things from a slightly different way. What I would say is that the brain, of course, is a physical thing. So if I'm right that the mind is not a physical thing, then the mind can't be the brain. But that would be a little bit quick, because people might say to me, of course, well, you know, the fact the brain is a physical thing shows why you're wrong in what you're saying. The brain, I think, is not a collection of capacities. The brain is a unified organ of the body. The brain has capacities, and the brain exercises those capacities. Some of those capacities are mental, and some of them aren't. There, some of the things that are done in the brain. The capacities of the brain are localized in the brain, and the capacities of mental capacities have location in the brain too, or they're related to locations in the brain. That should be something which is common ground among anyone who wants to study the mind. So the idea that there is some part of the brain which lights up, as they say, when you talk, and there's another bit which lights up when you walk, that is not a discovery of recent MRI imaging. That's something that, you know, in broad outline people have known for many, many, many years, that different parts of the brain are responsible for different things. But that does not mean that the capacities of the brain are the capacities of the mind. So I want to say that the way I want to think of this is that think of what it is that psychology studies. Psychology studies the organism. So, for example, psychophysics is a discipline that tries to precisely correlate human responses, or I mean, if we're dealing with human subjects, human responses with physical stimuli. That's what psychophysics is. You start there with the organism and their responses. So you ask the subject to press a button if they see something, or to raise their hand if they see something, or to describe what they see. You're starting from the point of view of the subject. Of course, this activates things in their brain, and it's not that these things in their brain are irrelevant to them. But I want to distinguish on the categorical distinction between the brain, which is an organ and a unified object, and the mind, which is the collection of the psychological capacities. So this leaves me with two questions, and this is where I'm going to finish. And the first is, what are these capacities of? If they're not capacities of the brain. I should say at this point that I don't object to people saying, if someone wants to say the brain thinks, or the brain wants to do this, or that the brain is trying to do such and such a thing. That's perfectly okay, intelligible way of talking. There are some philosophers who want to police language and say that you can't talk in that way, or that if you talk in that way, you're led to say nonsense. But it's not nonsense to say the brain thinks. It's a sort of extension of the language from the central case of something thinking, which is when an organism thinks. So I say fundamentally these capacities are capacities of organisms. And then the second question, what makes a capacity a mental capacity? That's a whole nother big story. I have a view about that too. My answers to these two questions are that what are these capacities of? They're capacities of the organism or the animal or the subject of experience. I think the subject of experience is the organism. I think the person is the organism. I don't think that the person is identical with the organism, because I think that the organism existed before it was a person. But if you think of the organism as the fundamental thing that becomes a subject of experience, becomes a person, that is the locus of mental capacities. What makes a capacity mental? I have a view about that too, which I won't defend here, but I'll just say it to get the complete picture. Is that I agree with Brentano and Husserl and many others that what makes a capacity mental is intentionality, or the mind's direction upon an object. That is to say, the point of view on reality that we all have by having experiences, thoughts, and memories, imagination, and so on. But I haven't said anything about that. I just wanted to volunteer that. I haven't said anything about it here. I'll volunteer it as something that would fill out the whole picture. So this is Aristotle doesn't look so good here on the screen, but it's this Aristotle contemplating a bust of Homer by Rembrandt. I think the view that the capacities of an organism, the mental capacities of an organism, are what the mind is, has some affinity with some views of Aristotle's. I see the idea that the organism is a substance rather than that the substance is something in the more abstract conception of Descartes or Spinoza or Leibniz. The organism as a substance is part of my view insofar as I believe in substance at all. And so that's why I pay homage to Aristotle at that point. But I don't mean to say that I'm adopting all the details of Aristotle's vision. The mind-body question, then, for me, is not the question about how two distinct substances are related. And I think it would be better if we didn't teach students that that's what the question is. Nor is it the question of how to explain how the mind can be a physical thing. Because I think the mind isn't a physical thing. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. It is the very difficult but different question of how do we explain how our mental capacities are embodied in our brains and in our bodies. That's the mind-body question, and it's not a question. I don't think this is a question for a priori philosophy, but a priori philosophy could do a bit of the clearing away of the ground to see that that is the question of how we explain how our mental capacities are embodied in our brains and bodies. Now, I think that question requires neither a commitment to physicalism nor a commitment to dualism in any of these traditional senses. So that's why I think the question of physicalism is basically irrelevant to the mind-body question. I think it just requires a belief in psychological reality, and I call the belief in psychological reality psychologism, that is to say. Psychologism about the psychological. Psychologism about the logical is thought to be a mistaken doctrine. I think psychologism about the psychological must be correct. So, thanks very much.